jumping back into Netflow validation. So at this point, think about where we are in the deployment, right? We've got our boxes configured, our management console, flow sensors. We've got everything communicating. We've done some front-end configuration on the management console, customized it a little bit through SST for our customer. We need to validate that Flow's working. So before we leave the customer site today, we want to make sure that we are taking Flow inbound. Ideally, I mentioned this a couple times, Flow was configured before we got here, right, through change controls, et cetera. Even if it was going to an IP address that at the time wasn't configured to do anything, now it will, right, because we've configured our system. So we want to have Flow ready to go. So when you're looking at Flow, there's a couple common issues that we run into. The reason that we run into these issues is often quite simply misconfiguration. But I'll tell you, that really where I run into this with customers is because very few customers have formally gone through a global enterprise-wide Netflow enablement project. Most customers have either had pockets of Netflow enabled specifically for certain needs, whether they were troubleshooting something with TAC and they turned on Netflow in 1 or 2 boxes, or they turned on Netflow to troubleshoot something else on their own, or they had an acquisition that had some Netflow enabled. So again, what we often find is rather than a consistent Netflow deployment, we find Netflow configured differently in different places, partially configured. You really want to get your hands around this early on with the customer, even if it's a separate scope or part of the additional work that you're going to be doing in this scope is making sure you review their Netflow capabilities and make sure that they're configured consistently throughout the deployment. Now, once we start processing the data, we will begin to see if it's truly configured correctly. So some of the things that we'll see in our interface that need to be corrected, one, bad timers. So if the active or inactive timers are not set correctly, remember we want the active timer set to 60 seconds, inactive defaults to 15, but maybe it was modified. We want to make sure those are set correctly. We'll show you how to see that data, but if the active timers are not set to 60 seconds and they're still at 30 minutes or some other long length time framer, we can run into issues with the way we process data. We're expecting our data to come in ideally in 1-minute time slices. And also there are certain alarming conditions in data presentations that expect that as well. You may also have some bad configuration from missing fields, right? So if somebody performed their flow config like we showed earlier, maybe the key fields weren't configured correctly or they don't have all the correct collect parameters. I've seen things like flags missing or output, the output port, timers, timestamps missing, right? So there's a number of things that could be missing in their configuration that need to be corrected upon investigation and when we see the data in our product. Bad flow, right? If we see our bad flow ports or destinations, sometimes we expect to see a list of exporters and some are showing up and some are not. We may need to troubleshoot that and see why. Was it an ACL or a firewall? Was it just configured incorrectly? It's running on a bad port or sending to a bad destination IP address. Again, in the labs, we'll show you how to troubleshoot these things, as well as UDP director rules. The UDP director is a really nice way to simplify configuration of your end nodes for Netflow, syslog, SNMP, et cetera. However, always remember, if we're sending data to the UDP director and you are not configured to forward that data, it will not forward it. It will just drop the data. So we need to troubleshoot that as well. And again, we take our time in our labs to go through showing you many of these situations, how to identify the problem and how to correct the problem. So when you're viewing this in the labs, this is one of the screens you'll look at. This is the flow collector dashboard. Every flow collector has its own dashboard. You can simply double-click a flow collector object in the enterprise tree in the Java client to see the dashboard. We would expect to see this graphical representation, seeing it processing flow over time, as well as a list of all of the exporters that are sending flow to this collector at the bottom of the page. There are some things that we will look at on this table and on the screen that will tell us the different types of problems we may be having with one or more exporters. One example of that is the active timer not being set to 60 seconds. There is a field you can enable at the bottom of the flow collector dashboard or on the flow collection status report that is the longest duration export. Effectively, this column will tell us what is the longest amount of time that this collector had to wait for flow to come from a device. Now, if the active timer was set to 60 seconds, we would expect that to be around 60 seconds. Now, anything up to 90, 95, that's fine. Again, sometimes devices get busy and they choose to process packets over sending Netflow. That's important. We don't want to introduce latency as a result of of enabling Netflow. However, if you are seeing these devices sending data on much shorter time frames or much longer time frames, that is obviously something that needs to be corrected. So as long as we're in that, 90 plus down to 60, most of your collectors will probably be right in that 60 range. Some may be longer if they're busier, but we want to make sure that that's correct. And again, we'll show you how to inspect this, how to identify ones that are broken, and how to address it in the lab. Another thing we want to address when we're looking at exporters is that the interfaces are coming across. Remember, that requires SNMP polling to be enabled from the management console back to those exporters. It's something that we can begin to configure in the SST during initial management configuration. However, later on, we certainly can customize this further. We have the ability to configure more than one SNMP read-only string. So different portions of your environment may have different community strings they need to poll on. We can configure that by default. It's a 60-minute interval that's configurable as well, and we do support multiple SNMP versions, 1, 2, up through 3. So we can actually configure this so that they can poll the various devices the way they need to be polled and pull in the interface information, the speeds, which then relates to the utilization parameters.